The maid found out that the millionaire was going to marry another woman out of obligation. In a moment of courage, she confessed her feelings and changed his destiny. The Hartford mansion stood imposingly against the Boston sky, its Georgian windows reflecting the morning sun like watchful eyes. Savannah Mitchell adjusted her gray uniform as she crossed the meticulously trimmed gardens, her footsteps silent on the gravel of the main path. At 25, she had become an expert at going unnoticed, an efficient shadow that kept the gears of the house running smoothly. The sound of altered voices escaped from the library on the second floor. Savannah hesitated in the hallway, her hands clenching the silver tray with the breakfast she was supposed to deliver. The deep, authoritative voice of Maxwell Hartford, the family patriarch, came through the double oak doors. "You have responsibilities, Gideon. The merger with the Reynolds depends on this marriage. You can't just ignore years of planning because of your sentimentalities." Sentimentalities? Gideon's voice sounded bitter. "Is that what you call the right to choose who I spend the rest of my life with?" Savannah had known Gideon Hartford since she had started working at the mansion 3 years ago. At 30, he was the reluctant heir to the Hartford empire, a man who carried the weight of family expectations like a cross. Their interactions had been minimal. A polite thank you here, a polite request there, but enough for her to realize the loneliness behind his reserved smile. "Catherine Reynolds is the logical choice," Maxwell continued. "Our families have a history. The union of our businesses, it's always about business, isn't it?" Gideon's interruption was full of frustration. "Have you ever stopped to think that maybe I want something more than business transactions disguised as relationships?" Savannah knew she should walk away, continue on her way as if she had heard nothing. It was what she had always done. Watch without being noticed, keep secrets without ever revealing them. But something in Gideon's voice kept her there, paralyzed, as if those words were touching a long dormant string in her own heart. The sound of heavy footsteps approaching the door made her step back quickly. Gideon emerged from the library, his face a mask of restraint that couldn't completely hide the storm in his blue eyes. He almost collided with Savannah, who tried to dodge while holding the tray. "I'm sorry, Mr. Hartford," she muttered, lowering her eyes. But for the first time in 3 years, Gideon actually saw her. Their gazes met for a moment that seemed to stretch on indefinitely. "No, it was my fault," he replied, his voice softening. "Savannah, isn't it?" The sound of her name on his lips surprised her. "Yes, sir." How much did you hear?" The question came low, almost a whisper. Savannah felt her face heat up. "I didn't mean to. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have." "Don't apologize," Gideon interrupted her, running a hand through his dark hair in a tired gesture. "Sometimes I think the only real people in this house are the ones we're supposed to ignore." The comment caught her off guard, as did the bitterness in his voice. "Not every arranged marriage has to be empty," she heard herself saying, before she could stop herself. "But a marriage without love is like a house without a foundation. Sooner or later, it collapses." Gideon's eyes widened slightly, surprised at her unexpected frankness. For a moment, Savannah saw her job flash before her eyes. 3 years of hard work thrown away for a moment of thoughtless staring. "Go on," he said, to her surprise. Savannah swallowed, but something in the way he looked at her, as if he really wanted to listen, made her continue. "Love is not a business transaction. It can't be negotiated at board meetings or sealed with contracts. It's something that grows naturally. Like the roses in the garden, it needs time, care, and, above all, freedom to flourish." The sound of footsteps in the hallway caused them to separate abruptly. Victoria Hartford, the family matriarch, emerged from the living room, her sharp gaze taking in the scene with barely disguised disapproval. "Gideon, dear, Catherine will be arriving for lunch," she announced, completely ignoring Savannah's presence. "Please put on something appropriate." "Yes, Mother," he replied automatically, but his eyes lingered on Savannah for a moment longer before turning away. As she went about her daily routine, Savannah couldn't stop thinking about the meeting. For the first time, she had been more than a shadow in the Hartford mansion. She had been seen, heard, and that was as liberating as it was dangerous. At night, in her small room in the servants' annex, Savannah looked out of the window at the lights of the main mansion. Somewhere in there, Gideon Hartford was probably contemplating his predetermined future. She shouldn't care. It wasn't his place. It wasn't his world. But the words they exchanged seemed to vibrate in the air like notes of an unfinished song. What she didn't know, couldn't know, was that at that very moment, Gideon was in his library, an untouched glass of whiskey in front of him, mentally going over every word she had said. For the first time in years, someone had spoken to him not like a Hartford, but like a man. And that had changed everything. The Hartford mansion fell asleep under the starry Boston sky, its secrets and tensions temporarily silenced by the night. But something had begun to shift in its foundations, as subtle as the approaching dawn. The next morning, Savannah couldn't stop thinking about her meeting with Gideon. As she organized the silverware for breakfast, her hands moved automatically, polishing each piece to a shine, but her mind was stuck in the library, reliving that moment of unexpected connection. "You're very quiet today," observed Martha, the head housekeeper, her keen eyes studying Savannah over her half-moon glasses. "Has something happened?" "No, nothing," Savannah replied quickly, perhaps too quickly. Martha had been her mentor since arriving at Hartford Manor, a motherly figure who had guided her through the intricacies of high-end domestic service. The sound of heels on the marble floor announced Victoria Hartford's arrival in the dining room. "Martha, I need you to review the lunch menu. Catherine Reynolds has specific dietary restrictions, and everything needs to be perfect." Savannah kept her eyes down, continuing her work as she listened to the conversation. Catherine Reynolds, the bride chosen for Gideon. Something in her stomach contracted at the thought, a sensation she refused to examine further. "And you?" Victoria addressed Savannah directly for the first time in weeks. "Make sure the music room is spotless. Catherine is a talented pianist, and Gideon mentioned that he would like to hear her play after lunch." "Yes, ma'am," Savannah replied, maintaining the neutral tone that years of service had perfected. While cleaning the music room, Savannah couldn't help but sit down briefly at the piano. Her hands hovered over the keys, without touching them. Years ago, before her mother's death, in the financial difficulties that had driven her into domestic service, she had also played. Not with the refinement expected of someone like Catherine Reynolds, but with passion. "Do you play?" Gideon's voice startled her, causing her to rise abruptly from the piano bench. "No, sir. I was just cleaning up," she stammered, feeling her face burn. Gideon entered the room, closing the door softly behind him. "Yesterday," he began, his voice low and intense, "what you said about love, I can't stop thinking about it." Savannah felt her heart racing. "I shouldn't have spoken like that. It's not my place." "Why not?" Gideon interrupted her, taking a step towards her. "Why should your opinion be any less valid than anyone else's? In fact, it's the most honest thing I've heard in years." The silence between them vibrated with unspoken possibilities. Savannah could feel the danger of that moment, how much it could change everything. "Catherine will be here in a few hours," she finally said, taking a step back. "Catherine," Gideon repeated the name, as if it were a word in a foreign language. "Do you know why she was chosen? Because her father owns the largest hotel chain on the East Coast. A perfect fusion with my family's business. That's how it works in our world. Every relationship is a transaction." "Not every relationship has to be like that," Savannah replied softly. "How do you do it?" Gideon asked, running his hand through his hair in a gesture of frustration. "How do you manage to see everything so clearly?" "Maybe because I have nothing to lose," she answered honestly. "When you don't have expectations to meet or an image to maintain, it's easier to see the truth." The sound of voices in the hallway made them separate instinctively. Savannah quickly returned to her tasks, while Gideon approached the window, both trying to look busy when Martha entered the room. "Mr. Hartford, your mother is looking for you." "Something about the suit for lunch," Martha announced, her shrewd eyes registering the tension in the room. Gideon nodded, casting one last glance at Savannah before leaving. Martha remained in the room, watching Savannah with a mixture of concern and understanding. "Be careful, dear," she said softly. "Some dreams are too beautiful to come true." Martha's words weighed on Savannah for the rest of the morning. When Catherine Reynolds arrived, Savannah watched discreetly from the kitchen as the young socialite was greeted with great pomp by the Hartford family. Catherine was exactly as Savannah had imagined: elegant, sophisticated, and clearly at home in the Hartford world. Her designer dress and discreet but expensive jewelry screamed old money, and her practiced smile was perfect for magazine photos. During lunch, Savannah helped serve, moving silently around the table as conversation flowed about business, politics, and art. Catherine talked about her travels in Europe, about concerts and galleries, and Savannah could see Victoria Hartford practically glowing with approval. But it was Gideon's eyes that she couldn't help but notice, distant, absent, as if he were somewhere else entirely. Occasionally, their gazes would meet briefly, and in those moments Savannah felt as if all the oxygen had left the room. After lunch, as planned, everyone headed to the music room. Savannah found an excuse to stay close, arranging flowers in a vase while Catherine sat at the piano. The first notes of Chopin filled the air, technically perfect but somehow empty of emotion. Gideon was standing by the piano, exactly where he should have been, but his eyes kept meeting Savannah's in the reflection of the window glass. It was as if they shared a secret, a truth that no one else in the room could see or understand. When she finally managed to retreat to her room that night, Savannah allowed herself a moment of weakness. Sitting on her small bed, she let the tears fall not from sadness, but from fear. Fear of what she was beginning to feel, fear of what it might mean, fear of the consequences that would surely come. Because she had made the most basic mistake of all. She had allowed her heart to see Gideon Hartford not as the boss's son, not as the unattainable millionaire, but as simply a man, a lost man, searching for something real in a world of appearances. And now, she didn't know how to become invisible again. The days following Catherine Reynolds' visit brought a subtle change to Hartford Manor. To the untrained eye, everything remained the same. The same daily rituals, the same social conventions, the same expectations. But for Savannah, every corridor now held the possibility of a meeting with Gideon. Every silence carried the weight of unspoken words. Victoria Hartford had stepped up preparations for what she already considered an imminent engagement. The mansion was buzzing with event planners, decorators, and suppliers, all carefully selected to create what promised to be the social event of the year. "We need you to stay late today," Martha informed Savannah during the staff breakfast. "Mrs. Hartford is organizing a dinner to introduce Catherine to the company's board members." Savannah nodded, ignoring the tightness in her chest. Over the last few days, she had become an expert at maintaining a neutral expression while her heart contorted. "And be careful with those documents in the library," Martha added, lowering her voice. "Mr. Hartford has been spending a lot of time there lately, reviewing important contracts." The mention of the library reminded Savannah of her furtive conversations with Gideon in that space. Since the day of the piano, they had accidentally met several times, brief moments, exchanges of glances and whispered words that seemed to exist in a reality parallel to the routine of the mansion. That afternoon, while organizing the library, Savannah found a book of poetry left open on Gideon's desk. One verse was underlined: "The truth is not in what we show, but in what we hide." His hands trembled slightly as he touched the page. "It's Frost," Gideon's voice sounded behind her, making her turn quickly. "I always thought he had a good understanding of social masks." "I should just be cleaning up," Savannah started to apologize, but Gideon interrupted her with a gesture. "Please don't do that. Don't pretend to be less than you are. Not with me." He moved closer, keeping a respectful distance, but his eyes conveyed an intensity that made the air between them seem electrified. "Do you read a lot?" "Whenever I can," she admitted. "My mother was a literature teacher. She used to say that books are windows into lives we could have lived." "And what life would you choose to live, if you could?" The question hung between them, loaded with unspoken meanings. Before Savannah could answer, the library door opened. Maxwell Hartford entered, his eyes narrowing slightly at the sight. "Gideon, we need to discuss the terms of the contract with the Reynolds," he said, his voice calculatedly neutral. "You may leave, miss," he added, addressing Savannah without really looking at her. As she left the library, Savannah could feel the weight of Maxwell Hartford's gaze on her back. She knew that his presence had not gone unnoticed, that his conversations with Gideon were no longer a well-kept secret. During dinner that night, Savannah watched discreetly as she served the guests. Catherine was radiant in her navy blue dress, chatting animatedly about her recent trip to Paris. Gideon, sitting next to her, smiled and nodded at the appropriate moments, but his eyes occasionally wandered around the room, meeting Savannah's like compasses looking for north. "Isn't the young couple adorable?" one of the guests commented to Victoria. "They seem so suited to each other." "Yes, it's a perfect arrangement," Victoria replied, her satisfied smile not quite reaching her eyes. The Hartfords and the Reynolds finally united. Later, when the guest had left and the mansion was beginning to quieten down, Savannah found a folded note among the plates she was collecting. Gideon's elegant handwriting said only, "Winter Garden, midnight." She knew she should ignore the note, burn it, and forget it existed. But at midnight, her feet took her to the Winter Garden, where the moonlight filtered through the glass roof, creating dancing shadows among the plants. Gideon was already there, his tall figure jagged against the night. "You came," he said softly, as if afraid to break the stillness of the moment. "I shouldn't have come," Savannah replied, but made no mention of leaving. "My father noticed, you know, the way I look at you, how everything has changed since that conversation in the library." Gideon ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Savannah already recognized as a sign of his inner turmoil. "He called me today for a chat about responsibilities and expectations." "Mr. Hartford, Gideon," he corrected. "Please here now, I'm just Gideon." "Gideon?" she relented, savoring the name as if it were something precious and forbidden. "This can't go on. Your marriage to Catherine? A marriage arranged to benefit two families who only care about power and money," he interrupted, his voice bitter. "You've shown me a truth I can no longer ignore, Savannah. You made me see that there is something more real than all those masks we wear." A noise in the hallway made them freeze. Footsteps approached the Winter Garden. Quickly, Savannah hid behind a large fern as Martha entered the room. "Mr. Hartford," the housekeeper said, her voice carrying a gentle warning. "It's late." "Yes, Martha. I was just leaving." Gideon cast one last glance in the direction where Savannah was hiding before leaving. Martha waited until Gideon's footsteps had distanced themselves before she said, "You can come out, Savannah." Embarrassed, Savannah emerged from her hiding place. Martha studied her with a mixture of concern and understanding. "Some dreams are too dangerous to dream, dear," she said softly, "especially when they can hurt not only you, but everyone around you." That night, lying in her bed, Savannah thought of Martha's words, of Maxwell Hartford's gaze, of Catherine's practiced smile. But most of all, she thought of Gideon and the truth they had discovered together. A truth that made it impossible to go on living in the shadows of invisibility. The tension in the Hartford mansion grew like a silent storm. The furtive encounters between Savannah and Gideon had not gone unnoticed, and Maxwell and Victoria Hartford's gazes were becoming more scrutinizing every day. Martha, ever vigilant, seemed to be everywhere at once, like a guardian trying to prevent the inevitable. It was a Saturday morning when Victoria called all the staff together for a meeting in the utility room. Her aristocratic face maintained its usual composure, but there was a calculated hardness in her eyes. "As you all know, Mr. Gideon's engagement will be announced shortly," she began, her gaze briefly landing on Savannah. "I expect absolute professionalism from each and every one of you. Any distraction will not be tolerated." Savannah felt the weight of those words like stones in her stomach. Beside her, Martha discreetly squeezed her hand under the table, a gesture of comfort that only made her heart squeeze even tighter. Later that day, while organizing the library, a task that now seemed fraught with dangerous memories, Savannah found a folder of documents on Maxwell Hartford's desk. Her eyes involuntarily caught a few words. "Hartford Reynolds prenuptial agreement." Interesting reading? Maxwell's voice made her freeze. He was standing in the doorway, his gaze cold and calculating. "I'm sorry, Mr. Hartford. I was just organizing." "Sit down, Miss Mitchell," he ordered, closing the library door. "I think we need to have a talk." Heart pounding, Savannah obeyed. Maxwell sat behind his imposing desk, studying her for a moment that seemed to stretch on endlessly. "You're a competent employee," he began. "Discreet, efficient, exactly what we're looking for. But lately, I've noticed that you've forgotten your place. Sir, don't interrupt me. His voice cut like steel. The Hartfords have built an empire over generations. Every alliance, every marriage, every decision has been carefully planned. I won't allow a maid to destroy the future of this family because of a romantic whim. Savannah felt her cheeks burn, but kept her posture straight. There was nothing improper, Mr. Hartford. Not yet, he replied, his eyes piercing. And there won't be. I have here, he opened a drawer, a generous offer, a substantial check and excellent references for any job you want in another state, of course. The shock made Savannah turn pale. You're firing me? I'm offering you a dignified way out before things get unpleasant. At that moment, the library door opened and Gideon entered. His face changed as he took in the scene, understanding and fury crossing his features. Dad, what's going on here? A necessary conversation, Maxwell replied calmly, about boundaries and consequences. Savannah, please leave us alone, Gideon asked, his voice tense but gentle. She stood up, her legs trembling slightly, and left the library. But she remained close enough to hear the altered voices that soon began to echo through the door. You have no right to interfere like that. Gideon's voice was charged with anger. I have every right when it comes to the future of this family. You're acting like a rebellious teenager, not the Hartford heir. And you're acting like a tyrant, trying to control every aspect of my life, buying and selling people as if they were shares on the stock exchange. That's how the world works, Gideon. Do you think you can throw it all away because of a fling with a maid? Don't talk about her like that. The sound of something being knocked over startled Savannah. Savannah has shown me more truth in a few conversations than you have in my entire life. The silence that followed was deafening. When Maxwell spoke again, his voice was dangerously controlled. You have two choices, Gideon. Assume your responsibilities, marry Catherine and keep your place in this family. Or what, Dad? Disown me? Kick me out of the company? From the family? If necessary, yes. Savannah couldn't listen any longer. She ran through the corridors until she reached the back garden, where she finally let the tears fall. The weight of the consequences of her actions, of the impossibility of her feelings for Gideon, seemed to suffocate her. Martha met her there a few minutes later, offering a handkerchief and her understanding silence. What do I do, Martha? Savannah asked, her voice breaking. What does your heart say, darling? My heart? She laughed bitterly. My heart is destroying me. It's destroying everything. Sometimes, Martha said softly, we need to lose everything to find what really matters. That night, after the mansion fell asleep, Savannah began to pack her things. Her hands trembled as she folded uniforms and put away the few personal belongings she had accumulated over the last 3 years. Maxwell Hartford's check remained untouched on her dresser. She wouldn't take it. She wouldn't sell her feelings for Gideon. A soft sound at the door made her turn around. Gideon was standing there, his face marked by exhaustion and determination. Don't go, he said simply. I have to. You know that. No, I don't have to accept that. I don't have to accept anything they have planned for me. Gideon. She moved closer to him, allowing herself to touch him for the first time, her hand gently on his cheek. Your father is right about one thing. You have responsibilities, a whole life built up, an empty life, he interrupted, taking her hand. Until you showed me it could be different. The moment between them was full of possibilities and impossibilities, dreams and realities, love and consequences. And there, in the silence of the night, they both knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The news of the confrontation between Gideon and his father spread through Hartford Manor like fire through dry straw. The whispers in the corridors ceased abruptly when Savannah passed, replaced by looks that mixed pity and disapproval. The tension was palpable in every room, in every interaction, as if the house itself was waiting, holding its breath, for the next act of the drama. Victoria Hartford intensified the preparations for the engagement dinner, scheduled for the end of the week, as if speeding up the plans could contain the storm that was brewing. Florists came and went with elaborate arrangements. Musicians rehearsed in the music room, and the kitchen staff worked frantically on the tasting menus. I need you to supervise the tidying up of the main hall, Martha instructed Savannah one particularly hectic morning. Her eyes carried a maternal concern that made Savannah's heart squeeze. And Savannah, Catherine Reynolds will be arriving early today for the final fittings of the dress. The mention of the wedding dress was like a stab. Savannah nodded mechanically, focusing on the practical tasks so as not to succumb to the pain that threatened to overflow. As she organized the tables in the hall, her hands trembled slightly as she arranged each crystal goblet, each linen napkin. "You're still here." Maxwell Hartford's voice surprised her. He was standing in the entrance hall, his imposing figure casting a long shadow over the marble floor. "I thought our conversation about your departure had been clear." "I've given my proper notice, Mr. Hartford," Savannah replied, keeping her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I will work until the end of the week, as is my right." "Rights," he repeated the word with a humorless smile. "You talk about rights while trying to destroy my son's future? It was never my intention." "Your intentions are irrelevant," he interrupted her. "What matters are the consequences. And believe me, Ms. Mitchell, you don't want to face the consequences of continuing to interfere in this family's life." Before Savannah could reply, Catherine Reynolds entered the room, radiant in her designer dress. Her smile faltered slightly as she noticed the tension in the room. "Mr. Hartford, what a pleasant surprise," she exclaimed, quickly regaining her composure. "I was just looking for Gideon. We need to discuss some details of the announcement." "My son is in the library," Maxwell replied, his expression instantly softening. "Let me accompany you." As soon as she was alone, Savannah allowed herself a moment of weakness, leaning on one of the tables. The contrast between her and Catherine couldn't have been more obvious. A sophisticated heiress versus a domestic servant, a world of difference separating their realities. Later that day, while putting clean towels away in the second-floor closet, Savannah heard voices coming from the master bedroom. The door was ajar, and she recognized Victoria Hartford's voice. "You need to do something about Gideon," Victoria said, her voice tense. "He's distant, distracted. Catherine has noticed, Max. If we lose this alliance with the Reynolds, we won't lose anything," Maxwell replied firmly. "I've already made arrangements about the distraction. It's only a matter of time before everything gets back on track. And if it doesn't, what if he really is willing to throw it all away for her? Then he'll learn the hard way that some choices have irreversible consequences." The threatening tone in Maxwell's words made Savannah shudder. She walked away silently, her mind a whirlwind of worry. It wasn't just her job or her heart at stake. It was Gideon's future, his relationship with his family, everything he knew. That night, unable to sleep, Savannah walked out into the garden. The full moon bathed the roses in silver light, creating shadows that danced in the gentle breeze. It was there that Gideon found her, as if his footsteps would inevitably lead him to her. "You should be with Catherine," Savannah said softly, without turning around. "I should be doing a lot of things," he replied, stepping closer. "I should be being the perfect son, the devoted fiancé, the responsible heir. But for the first time in my life, I'm choosing to be just myself. At the cost of what, Gideon?" She finally turned to face him. "Your father has made it clear that he won't hesitate to disinherit me, throw me out of the company." He stepped forward, his eyes intense in the moonlight. "Maybe that's exactly what I need. A chance to find out who I am without the weight of the Hartford name." "I can't be responsible for that," Savannah whispered, her voice breaking. "I can't be the reason you lose everything." "You're the reason I'm finally finding something real," he replied, his hands framing her face gently. "Something all the Hartford's money can't buy." The sound of footsteps on the gravel made them separate abruptly. Catherine was standing at the entrance to the garden, her face a mask of shock and understanding. For a moment, no one moved, the air heavy with the weight of truths long denied. "So that's it," Catherine finally said, her voice surprisingly calm. "That's why you've been so distant?" "Catherine," Gideon began, but she held up a hand to silence him. "No," she said, a sad smile playing on her lips. Maybe we should all stop pretending." She turned and left the garden, her elegant steps even in retreat. The silence that remained was deafening, heavy with the weight of the consequences that would surely come. "It changes everything," Savannah said softly. "It only changes the inevitable," Gideon replied. "The truth always finds its way into the light, no matter how much we try to hide it in the shadows." That night, as Hartford Manor fell asleep, two hearts stayed awake, contemplating the price of truth and the value of true love. The coming storm promised to change not only their lives, but everyone around them, and there was no turning back. The news of the confrontation in the garden between Gideon, Savannah, and Catherine spread through the Hartford mansion like wildfire. The next morning, Victoria Hartford canceled all her appointments and locked herself in her office with Maxwell, while a series of urgent calls were made and received. The muffled sound of altered voices escaped through the closed door, echoing the tension that permeated every room in the house. Savannah tried to keep busy with her usual tasks, but it was impossible to ignore the stares and whispers that followed her. Martha had tried to protect her by assigning her to more remote areas of the mansion, away from accusing eyes and sharp tongues. "The Reynolds have called off the engagement," Martha informed in a low voice, finding Savannah in the laundry room. "Catherine left this morning, and Mr. Reynolds is threatening to withdraw all support for the Hartford business." The weight of guilt made Savannah lean against the wall. "I never meant to do so much damage." "Sometimes," Martha replied softly, "love causes more destruction than hate, not because it's wrong, but because it challenges the order that people have fought so hard to establish." A movement at the door caught their attention. Victoria Hartford was standing there, her normally composed face marked by a calculated coldness. "Martha, leave us," she ordered. When they were alone, Victoria studied Savannah with a penetrating gaze. "You must be very pleased with yourself." "Ma'am, No," Victoria interrupted her, holding up a hand. "I don't want to hear your excuses or justifications. I want you to understand exactly what your actions have cost. The Reynolds weren't just business partners. They were the anchor that kept several of our companies stable. Without their support, hundreds of jobs are at risk." Savannah felt the blood run cold in her veins. "I never intended." "Your intentions are irrelevant," Victoria continued, her voice cutting. "What matters are the consequences. And now, thanks to your little romance, it's not just the Hartford fortune at stake, it's the lives of entire families who depend on us." The silence that followed was as heavy as lead. Victoria approached, her expensive perfume mixing with the smell of fabric softener from the laundry. "You have until tomorrow to leave," she declared. "Your final payment and references will be sent by post. If you're still here after that, the consequences will be less pleasant." At that moment, Gideon appeared in the doorway of the laundry, his face tense as he surveyed the scene. "Mom, that's enough." "No, Gideon, it's not enough." Victoria turned to face him. "Do you have any idea what your father is going through? Decades of work, generations of family history, all threatened because you decided to rebel like a teenager? Rebel?" Gideon stepped forward, his voice shaking with restrained emotion. "Is that how you see true love? Like a rebellion? True love?" Victoria laughed humorlessly. "What do you know about true love? You grew up in a protected world, where your every whim was catered for. Now you think you can throw it all away for a romantic fantasy?" "It's not a fantasy," Gideon replied firmly, moving to stand next to Savannah. "For the first time in my life, I'm seeing beyond the masks we've been taught to wear. And if that means losing everything the Hartfords have built, maybe it's because it's time to build something new, something based on truth, not appearances." Victoria studied them for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "You've always been too idealistic, Gideon, just like your Uncle Edward." The mention of that name made Gideon stiffen visibly. The uncle who was disowned for marrying someone the family didn't approve of? "The uncle who died alone and broke," Victoria corrected harshly. "Sometimes tradition and duty aren't chains that bind us. They're anchors that keep us safe during the storm." She headed for the door, pausing only for a moment. "You have a choice to make, Gideon. I hope you're wiser than Edward." After Victoria left, Savannah and Gideon remained silent, the hum of the washing machines filling the void between them. "Who was Edward?" Savannah finally asked. Gideon sighed, running a hand through his hair. "My father's younger brother. He fell in love with a local artist. No scandal, just love. The family didn't approve. They thought she was beneath us. Edward chose love. And what happened? He was disinherited, cut off from his family. He tried to build his own life. But Gideon paused, his voice breaking. Years of privilege hadn't prepared him for the real world. He and Sarah, his wife, fought for years. When she died of cancer, he couldn't afford the treatment. She died 6 months later. Savannah felt tears burn her eyes. Is that why your mother mentioned him? As a warning? As a threat, Gideon corrected bitterly. But there's a crucial difference between Edward and me. I've spent the last few years learning the business, building my own connections. I'm not just the Hartford heir. I'm my own person. He turned to face her, taking her hands in his. Savannah, I know I'm asking a lot. I know it's unfair to put so much weight on your shoulders, but I need you to know that I'm not choosing between you and my family. I'm choosing between a life of lies and a chance at the truth. What if your mother is right? Savannah whispered. What if people really do lose their jobs because of us? Then we'll find a way to help them, Gideon replied with determination. But we can't live our lives based on fear of what might happen. Sometimes, we need to have the courage to follow our hearts. At that moment, in the simplicity of the Hartford Mansion's laundry room, two souls found strength in each other to face the coming storm. Their love had ceased to be just a forbidden romance and had become a declaration of independence, a choice between the comfort of golden chains and the uncertainty of freedom. And as the sun set over Boston, casting long shadows through the mansion's windows, Savannah and Gideon knew there was no turning back. The price of the truth would be high, but the cost of denying it would be even greater. The news of the breakup between the Hartfords and the Reynolds spread quickly through Boston social circles. In less than 24 hours, shares in Hartford companies began to fall, and financial newspapers were speculating about the future of the family empire. The mansion, once a symbol of power and stability, now looked like a silent battlefield, where every room held a new tension. Maxwell Hartford had called an emergency meeting of the board of directors, and executives in suits were arriving in a constant procession of luxury cars. Savannah watched them through the kitchen windows as they went about their tasks, each face carrying the weight of impending decisions that would affect hundreds of lives. "They're talking about mass layoffs," Martha commented quietly, handing Savannah a tray of coffee to take to the meeting room. 3 of the smaller subsidiaries could close by the end of the month. The weight of that information made Savannah hesitate. How many people? "At least 200 families," Martha replied, her tired eyes revealing sleepless nights. "And that's just the beginning." When Savannah entered the meeting room, the tension was palpable. Maxwell Hartford was standing in front of a screen showing graphs in free fall, while Gideon sat next to an empty chair, the seat that should have been occupied by Jonathan Reynolds, now a physical reminder of the broken agreement. "The projections for the next quarter are even worse," one of the executives was saying. "Without the Reynolds support, we've lost credibility in the market. Investors are nervous. We can look for other partners," Gideon suggested, his voice firm despite the fatigue evident on his face. "I have contacts who—" "Contacts?" Maxwell interrupted him with a bitter laugh. "The Reynolds were more than business partners. They were a guarantee of stability. Your little rebellion didn't just cost you a marriage. It cost you the trust of an entire business network." Savannah silently poured the coffee, trying to make herself invisible again in a role that now seemed painfully ironic. But as she turned to leave, Maxwell's voice stopped her. "Miss Mitchell," he called out, making everyone in the room turn to her. "Since you're such an integral part of this situation, perhaps you should stay and hear exactly the impact of your actions." "Dad," Gideon stood up, his voice laden with warning. "No, son. It's important that she understands." Maxwell approached Savannah, his eyes hard as steel. "Do you see these figures? Every percentage point represents a family that could lose its income. Every falling graph is a dream being destroyed. And all for what? For a forbidden romance that you encouraged?" "Enough." Gideon slammed the table, making the cups clink. "Savannah is not responsible for decades of questionable business decisions. If we're vulnerable to the point where an arranged marriage defines our future, perhaps the problem runs deeper." A heavy silence fell over the room. The executives fidgeted uncomfortably in their chairs as father and son faced each other in a silent clash. "Mr. Hartford," Savannah finally spoke, her voice trembling slightly but gaining strength. "You're right, every number on that chart represents a real life, a real family. And that's why I can't pretend it's simple." She turned to Gideon, unshed tears shining in her eyes. "I love you, and it's because I love you that I can't be the reason other people lose their livelihoods." "Savannah, don't let me finish," she asked softly. "Your father is right about one thing. Actions have consequences. But he's wrong to think that true love is a weakness. It's a strength that makes us want to be better, that gives us the courage to face difficult truths." She placed the tray on the table carefully. "That's why I'm leaving, not because I don't love you enough, but because I love you too much to see you destroy everything your family has built." "It's not that simple," Gideon argued, his voice breaking. "We can't let fear dictate our lives." "It's not fear," Savannah replied. "It's responsibility. The same responsibility your father talks about, but for a different reason. Not out of tradition or appearances, but out of compassion." Maxwell Hartford watched the exchange with an unreadable expression. For a moment, something akin to respect crossed his face. "If I may," one of the older executives said, "perhaps there is a third way. Mr. Hartford Gideon, your ideas for modernizing the company have merit. With or without the Reynolds, perhaps it's time to consider a new direction. A direction that doesn't depend on alliances through marriages." Another executive agreed. "The market is changing. Maybe we should change too." The room fell into a contemplative silence. Maxwell Hartford looked at his son, then at Savannah, and finally at the graphs on the screen. "Do you really love her?" he asked Gideon, his voice softer than usual. "More than any title or fortune," Gideon replied without hesitation. Maxwell nodded slowly. "Then maybe it's time to reevaluate not just our business, but our priorities." The words hung in the air like a peace offering, fragile but real. Savannah felt the weight of the moment, the possibility of real change rising from the ashes of what seemed like total destruction. The meeting continued, but now with a different tone. It was no longer about saving the past, but about building a future that could perhaps accommodate both tradition and true love. When Savannah finally left the room, her hands were still shaking, but her heart was lighter. Martha was waiting for her in the hallway, an understanding smile on her face. "Sometimes," the housekeeper said softly, "you have to be willing to lose everything to gain what really matters." The morning following the council meeting brought with it a different atmosphere to Hartford Manor. The old walls that had witnessed generations of tradition now seemed to breathe with unexplored possibilities. Savannah noticed this change as she went about her morning chores, noticing how even the air seemed lighter, despite the gravity of the situation. Victoria Hartford found her in the winter garden, where Savannah was tending the orchids, a task that had always been her favorite. The Hartford matriarch was impeccably dressed as always, but there was something different about her posture, an almost imperceptible softening in her eyes. "My mother grew orchids," Victoria commented, surprising Savannah with her informality. "She said they were like people who need the right environment to flourish, but when they find it, their beauty is incomparable." Savannah remained silent, uncertain how to respond to this unexpected opening. "Yesterday," Victoria continued, "while I was watching you in the meeting room, I remembered something I'd forgotten a long time ago. Before I married Maxwell, I was a piano teacher." "You?" Savannah couldn't contain the surprise in her voice. "Yes," a wistful smile crossed Victoria's face. "But when I got married, I gave up music. It was what you'd expect from a Hartford girl. Tradition, duty, sacrifice. Words that defined my life for so long that I forgot who I was before them." Victoria approached one of the orchids, gently touching its petals. "When I saw how you were willing to give up your love to protect other people, I understood something important. Sometimes the real duty lies not in keeping empty traditions, but in having the courage to change them." "Mrs. Hartford, please," Victoria interrupted her gently. "Call me Victoria. I think we're past the point of formalities, aren't we?" The moment was interrupted by Martha, who hurried into the winter garden. "Pardon the intrusion, but Mr. Gideon is looking for you too. It seems important." They found Gideon in the library, surrounded by papers and with an energy that Savannah hadn't seen for days. Maxwell was with him, his expression a curious mixture of concern and pride. "I found a solution," Gideon announced as soon as they entered. "A way to save the jobs and modernize the company at the same time." He spread some documents out on the table. "For the past few years, I've been developing a side project, a green technology division that could revolutionize how our hotels work. The Reynolds weren't the only ones interested in our market. I have 3 investors willing to support the transition. Why haven't you mentioned this before?" Maxwell asked, his voice more curious than accusatory. "Because," Gideon hesitated, looking at Savannah, "because I was too busy trying to be the son you wanted me to be. But Savannah showed me that being true to yourself doesn't mean letting others down. It means finding your own way to make a difference." Victoria approached the documents, her eyes quickly scanning the financial projections. "That could work," she muttered. "In fact, that could be exactly what we need. Not just work," Maxwell added, "but put us at the forefront of the industry. A complete renewal of the Hartford brand." "What about the jobs?" Savannah asked, her heart still heavy with responsibility. "They will not only be maintained, but expanded," Gideon replied, his face lighting up with enthusiasm. "The project will require training in new technologies, creating entire departments dedicated to sustainability. It's a chance not just to save the present, but to build a better future." Martha, who had been standing discreetly in the doorway, let out a small sob of relief. Victoria immediately turned to her with a gentle smile. "Martha, please gather all the staff in the main hall. I think we have an important announcement to make." As the staff gathered, Savannah observed how the old hierarchies seemed momentarily dissolved. Gardeners chatted with executives. Housekeepers exchanged smiles with directors. It was as if the Hartford mansion was finally breathing in unison. Maxwell Hartford stood in front of everyone, his presence commanding immediate attention. But when he spoke, his voice carried a humility that Savannah had never noticed before. "For generations, the Hartfords have built their legacy on traditions and expectations. Today, I realize that perhaps we have mistaken rigidity for strength. My son," he looked at Gideon with evident pride, "has shown me that true strength comes from the ability to change, to grow, to see value where others see only conventions to be followed." Victoria joined him, her hand finding his in a long-forgotten gesture of union. "As of today, Hartford Enterprises will not just be a family name, but a community. Each of you is a vital part of that transformation." Gideon then stepped forward, pulling Savannah gently with him. "And that transformation wouldn't be possible without someone who had the courage to speak truths we needed to hear, even when it meant risking everything." The silence that followed was broken by Martha, who began to applaud. Gradually, the applause spread around the room, growing into an ovation that seemed to make the very walls of the mansion vibrate with new life. Later, in the garden where it had all begun, Savannah and Gideon found a moment of stillness. The sun was setting over Boston, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that seemed to reflect the promise of a new dawn. "I still can't believe it," Savannah murmured, her hands intertwined with Gideon's. "It feels like a dream." "It's not a dream," he replied softly. "It's what happens when people have the courage to be true, to fight for what they believe in. You taught me that, Savannah. You taught us all." The future still held challenges, of course. Transformations are never easy, and profound changes take time and dedication. But there, at that moment, as the last ray of sunshine illuminated the Hartford mansion, there was a certainty shared by all. Sometimes you have to break traditions to build something stronger, truer, more human. The transformation of the Hartford mansion was taking place not only in big announcements and corporate decisions, but in the small details of everyday life. A week after the meeting that had changed everything, Savannah noticed how even the air seemed different as she walked through the familiar corridors. The old invisible barriers separating bosses and employees were beginning to dissolve, replaced by a sense of common purpose. Victoria Hartford had surprised everyone by reopening the music room, which had remained virtually untouched since her youth. One particularly sunny morning, Savannah found the matriarch sitting at the piano, her fingers gliding hesitantly over the yellowed keys. "You know," Victoria commented without turning around, having noticed Savannah's presence. I spent so much time trying to be the perfect Hartford wife that I forgot what it was like to just be Victoria. Music was my voice, my way of expressing everything I couldn't say in words. Savannah approached cautiously. It's never too late to rediscover that voice. No, Victoria smiled, a genuine smile that softened all her features. And maybe that's what you and Gideon are teaching us, that some traditions need to be broken in order for us to find our true melody. The sound of footsteps in the corridor heralded the arrival of Martha, who brought an animated expression to her normally serene face. The first reports from the sustainability project have just arrived. Mr. Gideon is gathering everyone in the main hall. The news spread a wave of anticipation through the mansion. Employees from all departments converged on the hall, where Gideon and Maxwell were waiting. The old hierarchy that would have kept domestic servants in the shadows was noticeably absent. Everyone was an equal part of this new phase. The initial figures are promising, Gideon announced, his voice carrying an infectious enthusiasm. 3 of our largest hotels have already begun the transition to solar energy, and operating costs have dropped significantly. More importantly, we have received partnership proposals from companies that share our new vision. Maxwell, who watched his son with obvious pride, added, and that's just the beginning. Every employee will have the opportunity to participate in training programs in green technologies. Hartford Enterprises won't just be a family business, it will be a corporate family. Savannah watched the scene with an overflowing heart. Seeing Gideon in his element, leading not through imposition but through inspiration, was like witnessing the birth of something truly extraordinary. Later, in the garden that had witnessed so many crucial moments in their history, Savannah found a quiet moment to absorb all the changes. The sound of familiar footsteps made her smile before she even turned around. I thought I'd find you here, Gideon said softly, taking a seat next to her on the stone bench. This place always seems to call to us at important moments. It's really happening, isn't it? Savannah asked, still hardly believing it. All these changes, thanks to you, he replied, taking her hands in his. You've given me the courage not only to follow my heart, but to be the person I've always wanted to be, to lead in the way I believe is right. You've always had that strength inside you, she protested gently. I just helped you see it. And that's exactly the point. A new voice joined the conversation. Maxwell Hartford emerged from the shadows of the garden, his face bearing a thoughtful expression. Sometimes we need someone from outside our circle to show us truths we were too blind to see. He approached the couple, his next words clearly chosen with care. I spent so much time worrying about preserving the Hartford legacy that I almost destroyed its future. Savannah, you didn't just save my son from a loveless marriage. You saved this family from itself. The moment was interrupted by Martha, who appeared panting in the garden. Sorry to intrude, but we've just had an important call. Catherine Reynolds is on her way to the mansion. The news struck like a bolt out of the blue. Catherine hadn't given any news since her abrupt departure, and her sudden return carried a weight of uncertainty. She's not coming alone, Martha continued. Her father, Jonathan Reynolds, is with her. Maxwell straightened his shoulders instinctively. Years of difficult negotiations reflected in his posture, but Gideon remained surprisingly calm, his hands still entwined with Savannah's. Maybe, he said thoughtfully, this is the time to turn another kind of tradition on its head. We don't have to be business rivals just because there wasn't an arranged marriage. What did you have in mind? Maxwell asked, a new curiosity in his voice. A different kind of partnership, Gideon explained. One based on shared values and a vision of the future, not on forced family alliances. The Reynolds have always been pioneers in sustainable hospitality on the West Coast. Imagine what we could accomplish by working together, each maintaining their independence but joining forces for the greater good. The idea hung in the air like a brilliant possibility. Maxwell nodded slowly, an understanding smile forming on his face. You know, he said, maybe it's time we all learn to build bridges instead of walls. As the sun set over the Hartford's garden, painting the sky in shades of hope, Savannah felt a deep peace settle in her heart. The changes that had begun with a moment of courage in a library continued to expand in ever-widening circles, transforming not just their lives, but an entire legacy. And perhaps that was the true magic of love. Not just its ability to unite two hearts, but its power to inspire transformations that reach far beyond itself, touching lives and changing destinies in ways we could never have imagined. Autumn was painting the gardens of Hartford Manor in golden hues when Catherine and Jonathan Reynolds arrived. The moment carried a historical weight, not only for the past it represented, but for the future it could define. Savannah watched from the library window as the elegant cars parked at the main entrance. "Are you ready?" Gideon asked softly, coming up behind her. His presence was a safe haven amidst the storm of emotions that this meeting promised. "I don't know if we'll ever really be ready for moments like this," she answered honestly. "But we're here, aren't we? And that's what matters." Victoria and Maxwell Hartford were waiting in the main hall, their postures reflecting a subtle but significant change. It was no longer the stiff protocol of before, but a more natural, more human dignity. Martha had organized a small breakfast in the Winter Garden, a more intimate and welcoming setting than the formal dining room. Catherine was the first to enter, and Savannah immediately noticed how different she also looked. There was a serenity in her face that hadn't been there before, as if she too had found her own truth in the midst of the storm. "Gideon," Catherine greeted with a genuine smile, surprising everyone, "and Savannah. It's good to see you both." Jonathan Reynolds entered soon after, his imposing bearing softened by a contemplative expression. "Maxwell, Victoria," he nodded. "I think we all have a lot to talk about." The breakfast that followed was surprisingly cordial. Martha, who was supervising the service, exchanged a meaningful glance with Savannah, both silent witnesses to a transformation that went far beyond business or tradition. "You know," Catherine began, placing her cup of tea on the table, "when I left here that day, I was furious, not just at Gideon or Savannah, but at a whole system that made us believe that love and business had to be the same thing." "Catherine," her father began, but she held up her hand gently. "Please, Dad, let me finish. Over the last few weeks, I've had time to think about who I am, about what I want for my life. And I realized that I was also hiding behind expectations that weren't mine." Jonathan Reynolds studied his daughter with a mixture of pride and understanding. "She's right," he admitted, turning to the Hartfords. "Maybe we all got lost at some point, confusing tradition with prison. That's why we're here," Catherine continued, "not to rekindle an engagement or keep up appearances, but to propose something new, something real." Gideon leaned forward, his hand discreetly finding Savannah's under the table. "The sustainable partnership proposal?" "Exactly," Jonathan nodded. "Catherine showed me your presentation on the green technology project. It's impressive, Gideon, and most importantly, it's about the future." Victoria, who had remained silent, let out a small smile. "You know, Jonathan, a few weeks ago I would have said that tradition is what defines us. Now I understand that what really defines us is our ability to grow, to change. And sometimes," Maxwell added, his gaze meeting Savannah's, "we need someone from outside our circle to show us the way." The conversation flowed naturally into practical details, partnership structures, pilot projects, implementation timelines. But there was something more going on in that room, something deeper than contracts and commercial agreements. It was the birth of a new way of doing business, one that didn't require the sacrifice of hearts. Later, when the Reynolds had left and the sun was beginning to set, Savannah found Martha in the garden. The housekeeper had been tending to her favorite roses since forever. "Do you know what's most extraordinary about roses?" Martha asked, without turning around. "They can be pruned almost to the root, and yet, next spring, they come back stronger than before." "Like people," Savannah smiled, understanding the metaphor. "Exactly like people," Martha nodded, finally turning to face her, "like a young maid who had the courage to speak truths to a young millionaire, and in the process, transformed not just two lives, but an entire legacy." The sound of music coming from the house caught her attention. It was the piano in the music room Victoria Hartford was playing again, for the first time in decades. The soft melody floated through the night air like a silent celebration of rebirth. Gideon found Savannah still in the garden, watching the stars that were beginning to appear in the Boston sky. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, hugging her from behind. About how unpredictable life is, she replied softly.